25 just when think things can't any worse. This guy shows up. Zacharias Bridge, 06.19.2022, 1235. The planetary defense grid was unleashing everything she had. But the Terran fleet was simply too big. There were 120 capital ships and countless support vessels. The latter included hundreds of death gliders, which were fighting the Satan Air Force inside the atmosphere. And things were not going much better for the ships. Zacharia's shields were down 50% already, and the weapons were taking a pounding. To make things worse, she had been separated from both the Orpheus and the Pride of Genii. At the helm, Major O'Neill was dodging his best to keep the ship from being surrounded, but their odds were not good. And when the Terran flagship, which was even bigger than the Haddock-class ships, appeared ahead of them, they dropped to zero. "Divert power to," Laren said. That was as far as she got before the flagship fired a single shot. It hit them, and the shields collapsed. The engineering console exploded, as did the weapons controls. Chunks of the ceiling came down while the lights flickers. "Our engines are down," O'Neill said. "We're a sitting duck." Before Laren could reply, the room went dark. And it was not the only place. Atlantis Control Room 06.19.2022, 1235. The Terrans had dialed in and tried to send troops through the Stargate, but the iris was closed, and that was that. And even if the iris had been open, their chances would not have been good. Several security teams had taken up positions around the gate room. And both 50 caliber guns were ready to do their thing. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Orlov was in the control chair and firing drones. Instead of firing large amounts of drones, he was launching one drone at a time. But he was making those single drones count, shooting down and damaging targets left and right. Beside the drones, Atlantis had also been provided with several dozen railguns. Ronan and Taylor were manning 2 of these, while McKay was working in the control room. Woolsey had taken over Rodriguez's console so that she could take charge of one of the railguns. As for Weir, she had grabbed a P-90 and joined the security people. Suddenly, the wormhole disengaged. Before she could ask what was going on, there was an odd hum and the lights in the room faded. "'Tis Caligula Cockpit, 06.19.2022, 1231. The Caligula was an Alkesh, which was parked next to the Stargate on M7F-112. 112 was an uninhabited world at the very edge of the Pegasus galaxy, and when the Caligula had arrived at the planet, it had discovered why fairly quickly. The planet had an orbit made it so that one side always faced the sun, while the other faced away from it. The sunny side was a scorching desert, while the dark side was solid ice. As for the Stargate, it was on the sunny side. The Caligula had placed a special satellite in orbit of the planet, before landing and beginning making modifications to the Stargate. Those were now complete. This was reported to Colonel Anita Sobel, the commander of the Caligula. Sobel entered a command into the ship's computer console, which caused the satellite in orbit to transmit a signal. That signal took about 4 minutes to reach Terran 1. Stargate Command General's Office, 06.19.2022, 1235. Carter was on the phone with President Quinn when the gate activated. There was an odd wobble on the phone, and the line died. As Carter put the receiver down, the lights in the room faded out. She made her way down to the control room, where Mitchell and Anders were already on top of things. Anders was closing the iris, and Mitchell was ordering security teams to the gate room. "What do we have, Cameron?" "It's an incoming wormhole from Pegasus," Mitchell said, "but it's not coming from Atlantis." "How is that?" And that was when the air in the gate room rippled and an image formed above the ramp. Tilda, no, it can't be, Tilda Carter thought. But maybe it was, and if it was, they were in big trouble. She exchanged a look with Mitchell. Then the figure began speaking. "'Tis Terran 1 Bridge, 06.19.2022, 1236. the Emperor stepped onto the holographic transmitter platform. It was sending his image to the enemy flagship, Atlantis, and even Stargate Command. He had sent the Caligula to arrange for the last of those three. "I am Anubis," he began, "and I have returned." And he had. For countless years, he had fought Oma Dasala, but then, somehow, the two of them had been separated and he had found himself in the Terran universe. In the years since, he had maneuvered himself closer to the throne, and now he was Emperor of the Terran Empire. "Tilda and nobody will take it from me, Tilda. Now I will crush the Satans, and then I will come for the Tory. Nothing will stop the doom I am about to bring down upon you." But while his return had shocked Carter and Mitchell, the Wraith had never heard of either Anubis or the Goa'uld, so they were not impressed, and they had other plans. Hive Ship Grand Conqueror Bridge 06.19.2022, 1236. The clock on the Bravos hit 0. To catch the Terrans by surprise, the Wraith had set the clock so that their attack came minutes after the invaders launched theirs. And when Anubis had made his transmission, they had been able to identify the enemy flagship. So when the Bravos began to deploy, they knew where to go. Tilda, the irony of us saving a human world. Tilda, but if Sata fell, then its allies would soon follow. And that would leave the Wraith fighting this enemy alone. Tilda, so here we are, coming to the aid of the humans. Tilda. "Commander, the first Bravos have reached their target. You know what to do." "Yes, Commander." Bone White nodded and entered the command. 2 seconds later, the Bravos began exploding. Zacharias Bridge 06.19.2022, 1237. Anubis' image vanished and the lights came back on. At the same time, large explosions were lighting up the space around the Zacharias. The Wraith were attacking the Terrans, which gave O'Neill time to reroute things. There was a beep as the thrusters and one of the sublight engines came back online. "Tilda, time to get out of here. Tilda," he fired up the engine and set course out of the flagship's weapons range. At the same time, the weapons officer had rerouted all the remaining power to the aft weapons and used them to cut loose. "Are we doing any damage?" Laren asked. The weapons officer, a young man called Paul, checked his readings. "Yes, Captain," he said, "but their shields are strong, ma'am." "Keep blasting, Paul," Laren began, "and divert all power to one shield. Jack, keep that shield facing the enemy." Paul and O'Neill nodded. As long as they could keep moving and shooting, they would have a fighting chance, which was exactly what Laren intended for them to keep doing. Tilda, of course, sooner or later, the Wraith will run out of ships. Tilda, but that was a problem for later. For now, they had a game plan and were sticking to it. Atlantis Chair Room 06.19.2022, 1237. Vasily was shooting down targets as best as he could. Tilda, one shot at a time. Vasily. Tilda, it was something he had learned from his father, who had been a Spetsnaz sniper. That had been until he had met a girl named Olga and had retired. 9 months later, Vasily had been born. And 2 years later, his mother had given birth to twins. First of the two had been Natasha, and then came Nikolai. Finally, there was Alexei. Born 2.5 years after the twins, he was the youngest child. Tilda, Alexei would love this. Tilda, Alexei was the only other Orlov in the armed forces. He had turned 18 years old in January and had enrolled in the Air Force, hoping to become a fighter pilot. Natasha had become a doctor, and Nikolai ran the family farm. Nikolai did so together with their father, who was also called Nikolai. Tilda, and so would Dad. Its sniping taken to the next level. Tilda, the name, was a bit of a family tradition. Vasily's grandfather had been called Nikolai. His grandfather had died before his father had been born, and Grandma had named the baby Nikolai Jr. And when the twins had been born, Nikolai Orlov III had come into the world. Completing the list, Olga was a fully trained nurse. She was still 5 years away from retirement, serving as the ranking nurse of an emergency room. equals slashback slash equals Lieutenant Orlov equals slashback slash equals Mr. Woolsey said over the radio. Equals slashback slash equals, how are things going over there? Equals slashback slash equals. Shooting them down as fast as I can, sir. Plenty of drones left. Equals slashback slash equals, keep at it. Equals slashback slash equals. Yes, sir. So that was exactly what Vasily did. But something told him that defeating this invasion was not going to be this easy. Tis Rome Bridge 06.19.2022, 1242. Emperor Anubis was furious, but Grand Admiral Apophis was interested. The Wraith had come to the aid of the Satans and were doing a considerable amount of damage to the fleet. Their first victim had been the Terran One, which had been hit by 3 of these Wraith suicide vessels. The explosions had damaged the flagship and collapsed its shields, leaving it an easy target for the manned Wraith vessels. And it had not been the only ship to be destroyed. As for Anubis, the Emperor had escaped the Terran One aboard a cargo ship and found shelter aboard the Rome. And he had made his anger clear by executing several of the ship's crew. Apophis, however, was studying the development. The conquest of the Pegasus galaxy in their home universe had been in 1997. During that conquest, Apophis had been a commodore in command of a task force in the 7th Fleet. The Wraith they had fought had only cared about protecting their own worlds. But these Wraiths were different. They are pragmatic. They were helping the Satans, knowing that this would force the Terrans to divide their forces between 2 fronts. Because if the Tory and their allies fall, they would have to fight us alone. But it was only a matter of time before they ran out of ships to blow up. And once they did, Apophis would make his move. Tis Alexander the Great Bridge 06.19.2022, 1232. Alexander had better weapons, but it turned out their prey could outrun both the ship and its energy bolts at sublight speeds, and the ship was heading towards the system's star as fast as she could. But between the star and the ship was a single planet. And Kalia suspected that this was where the Wraith would make their move, so he had no intention of letting them make it to the planet. He activated the intercom on his chair. Engineering, divert extra power to the engines. Equals slashback slash equals, yes, Commodore. Equals slashback slash equals. There was a jolt as the ship increased speed. Within seconds, they entered weapons range. And then everything went horribly wrong for the Alexander and her crew. Hive ship Bloody Talon Bridge 06.19.2022, 1233. Despite the fact that it was leading a Wraith counterattack, command of the Bloody Talon was not considered a prestigious job. The Wraith considered it an oversized freighter, which it was. But Precision, who had been nicknamed Billy by the Tory, had decided to prove that his ship was capable of doing battle. And winning, or else we are all dead. Then, the enemy ship increased speed, which was exactly what he had been hoping for. Because the only way for them to increase power was to divert power from somewhere else. And the only system that could provide enough power were the shields. Weapons officer, now. Yes, Commander. One of the flaws in Wraith hives was the fact that all of its weapons faced either forward or sideways. It lacked rear-firing weapons, but Precision had made modifications to the Bloody Talon. He had gotten his hands on 8 Traveler energy weapons on the black market and installed them to cover this gunnery blind spot. He had also gotten his hands on 2 Genii warheads. These warheads had been attached to costume-build missiles. These missiles were attached to 2 aft-facing hardpoints. When the weapons officer diverted power, the forward weapons went offline and the Traveler guns came to life. They cut loose, hitting the Terran ship. Enemy shields are beginning to fluctuate, sir. Maintain fire. Target their fighter bay and other locations that might cause secondary explosions. Yes, Commander. Bloody Talon kept shooting, but the enemy returned the favor. They scored several hits, blasting holes in the hull. "Tilda, come on, girl, don't fall apart on me now." Tilda, it was odd, but precision had become attached to his ship. Before his promotion, he had considered ships nothing but lifeless property. But now, things were different. Divert power to hull regeneration. "Yes, sir," the engineer said. As the engineer diverted the power, the Terrans blasted more holes in the Bloody Talon. So Precision decided to unleash the missiles. He watched as his weapons officer fired them. "Tilda, here we go." Tilda, both missiles exploded just before they would have hit the enemy shields. And that was exactly what they had been designed to do. They created a massive energy pulse, along with a giant radiation spike. Of course, there was plenty of radiation in space, so the ship was shielded against radiation even if its shields were down. But the spike was big enough to overcome that. This was made easier by the fact that shields came down. At the same time, Bloody Talon was still shooting. Her bolts hit the glider bay, creating an explosion as Precision had hoped. 2 more explosions followed before the Terran's shields came back online. But there was more to the plan. Because the Bloody Talon did not have any shields, it ended up absorbing part of the pulse. This was when a second modification went to work. The crew had installed a special grid that sucked up the energy and conducted it to a modified antennae. That antennae unleashed the energy at the Alexander, resulting in 2 of the shield emitters overloading. This created a hole in the shields. It was at this point that Kalia found out the hard way that he had been right about the planet being a trap. While there had not been any hive ships or cruisers to back up the Bloody Talon, Precision had managed to scrape together 27 scout ships. And they attacked the Alexander with everything they could muster, leading to more explosions. Meanwhile, the Bloody Talon had done a 180 and was now free to unleash her main weapons. After several salvos, the shields collapsed altogether. 3 minutes later, the Alexander exploded. Her pursuer eliminated, the Bloody Talon and her scouts headed for M4H-212. They had an invasion to stop. 26. The Pegasus Invasion, Part 2. Tis Rome Bridge, 06.19.2022, 12:45. The last suicide ship had exploded. Between them, they had wiped out Terran 1 and 31 Haddock-class ships. Tilda, not to mention countless support ships. Tilda, so now came the time for Apophis to make his move. This was made easier by the fact that the Wraith had joined the fleet, collecting all his targets in one place. Tilda, time to end it. Tilda, even with the Wraith here, he still had the numerical advantage. Not to mention the fact that the Terran ships were more advanced. Apophis activate the communications unit built into his command chair. All ships open fire, which was exactly what the fleet did. The defenders and the planetary defense grid returned fire, taking out several ships. But Apophis could see the power levels on the enemy ships dropping. It only a matter of time before they took the fleet out. That was when the senior weapons officer turned around. "Admiral, we are receiving distress call from our beachhead," he began. "The Wraith had launched a counter-attacks against 3 of our worlds. Our forces are requesting reinforcements, sir." "Order Task Force 3 to respond." "Yes, Grand Admiral," the officer said and gave the order. A dozen Haddock-class ships and their support vessels broke away and jumped into hyperspace. The distraction dealt with, Apophis turned his attention back to the enemy fleet. As a result, he didn't watch the long-range sensors. A single blue dot appeared, and then another, and another, and another. Within a minute, there were dozens of dots, and they were all moving towards the fleet. Atlantis Control Room, 06.19.2022, 12:45. Lieutenant Orlov had taken out enough death gliders and was now firing at the ships in orbit. That was the good news. The bad news was that the fleet was taking a pounding. "Tilda, we need a plan, or this is going to end badly," Tilda Woolsey thought. Alas, there were no allies for them to call on. Every ship all their allies could spare was already here, so it was time to get creative. When Atlantis and Vanaheimr had landed on Saita, they had done so on the planet's largest ocean. Called the Middle Sea, it was located between the two largest continents on the planet. The cities were parked near the island of Tavora, which was about the size of Luxembourg. Tavora had no locals, because the Saitans had never colonized it. This had been because the island had been pretty distant from any major settlements. But with 2 city ships to support it, colonization had become a very different proposition. The plan was to construct an underground city. This would not only hide it from enemies, it would also keep the surface free to be turned into farmland. But it had not taken long to discover that the island consisted of a layer of soil above solid rock. This had resulted in the construction teams needing explosives to do their work. And then word of the invasion had reached them. They had been evacuated to the mainland, leaving their explosives behind. Delivering the explosives could be done by means of Vanaheimr's Vanir transporters. But the problem was the fact that the explosives would not be powerful enough to destroy the enemy ships. But if we can disable them. Woolsey opened a channel to Vanaheimr. He was greeted by the sight of Ran, who was apparently helping out in their control room. Great minds and all that, I have a plan, Woolsey said. Good, tell me. So that was exactly what he did. Tis Rome Bridge, 06.19.2022, 1249. The Wraith reinforcements were in bad shape, and several of the Vanir ships had already been destroyed. The enemy had used an advanced teleporter to get the crews of the Vanir ships to safety, but Apophis considered this a simple stay of execution. Then the sensor interface beeped. The enemy was now using their teleporters to beam materials out. He was about to order his weapons officer to run an analysis when an explosion rocked the Rome. Explosives, Order all ships to engage their teleport jammers, now, he barked. Yes, Grand Admiral, the weapons said, before giving the order. The ships engaged their jammers, but several of them had already been damaged and others were simply too slow. 7 more explosions ripped through the Terran fleet. The enemy had targeted the engine rooms first, with the second target being the bridge. 4 ships had been hit in both the engine room and the bridge, leaving them crippled. Rome and 3 more ships had only been hit in the engine room. The problem was that the crippled ships were still moving, leaving them at risk of colliding with the rest of fleet. Not to mention the fact that they might explode. This forced Apophis to assign ships to tow them away from the battle site. He had barely finished giving the orders when his intercom came to life. // engine room to bridge, come in. // This is the Grand Admiral, report. // this is Engineer Daylac. The explosion was considerable, Admiral. 12 of the crew were killed, and the hyperdrive is offline. Sir // Daylac paused. // also, the fire suppression system is down and 8 weapons placements are non-responsive, sir. // Cut power to those weapons and divert it to the functional placements. Focus on the fire suppression system. We can fix the hyperdrive once the battle is over. // yes. Grand // That was as far as the engineer got before the channel went dead. Before he could ask what was going on, the lights on the bridge all went out. And that was only the beginning. Zacharias Bridge, 06.19.2022, 1252. Zacharias was barely capable of keeping herself from decompressing. One more hit and the whole ship would explode. This is the end, Laren thought. She was trying to signal for beam out from the Vanir, but the radio was dead. Then the sensors began to beep as something approached. It took some work, but she was able to get a view of the enemy fleet, and something was attacking them. The ships she could see appeared to be covered in some kind of dark cloud. Inside, she could lightning bolts blasting to and fro. "What is happening?" O'Neill asked. "I have no idea, but something tells me that the Terrans aren't going to like it." Laren got the feeling that O'Neill's assessment was dead on. Tilda, and if those clouds are as lethal as they look, the Terrans will simply end up dead. Tilda, but there were a lot of Terran ships, so Zacharia's changes were still slim to none. She hoped that the people on the planet were doing better. Atlantis Control Room, 06.19.2022, 12:55. Rodney McKay's fingers were flying over his keyboard. The energy signatures of the Terran fleet were fluctuating, and he was trying to figure out why. "Tilda, come on, tell me what we're looking at." Tilda, then the laptop beeped as one of his searches got a hit. He opened the right folder and read the results. "Oh, crap. You have something?" Woolsey asked. "Just after we arrived back on Atlantis, we encountered a shadow creature," McKay began. "It was part of the Ancients' research into ascension. The one you send to M4X 337. "Exactly," McKay said. "We later determined that the shadow creature was captured by the Ancients near the start of their stay in Pegasus. That creature wasn't thousands of years old as I first thought, it was millions. Now that creature was sentient but primitive. But if these are present-day members of the species, they are more millions of years, more evolved and smarter. And if they are capable of feeding on the Terran fleet..." McKay didn't have to finish the sentence. There was a good chance that one invasion had just been replaced by another. "Tis Rome Bridge, 06.19.2022, 12:55. All of the Rome's systems were breaking down. Whatever these clouds were, they were sucking the life out of the ships. Apophis was attempting to contact the rest of the fleet, but to no avail. Then the engineering console exploded. =//= hull breach on deck 3. =// the computer announced. =/ recommend ship evacuation. =/ Tilda been there, done that. Tilda, he had abandoned his previous flagship after the disaster at Earth. If history repeated itself, Emperor Anubis would execute him personally. Suddenly, the lights came back on and the list of failures stopped growing. He looked out the window that doubled as the main viewer. The cloud was gone. He tried the sensors, but they were offline. Tilda blast, Tilda suddenly, the communications unit on his chair beeped. =// come in, Rome. =// Who is this? Apophis barked into the unit. =// this is tis Istanbul, sir. =// the voice said. Tilda the Istanbul is an Alkesh. Tilda =// we are attempting to destroy the clouds, sir. But they are absorbing our weapons fire, sir. Orders, sir, =// Apophis considered his options. Between what he had seen and what he had just heard, he had realized that these clouds were not actually clouds. The fact that they had ignored the smaller targets was an indicator of decision-making, and that meant intelligence. Tilda, these being are feeding on energy. Tilda, they had attacked the capital ships, clearly labeling them as a bigger threat and source of food. Are the clouds moving from haddock to haddock? =// yes, Grand Admiral. =// Order the fleet to retreat to the beachhead. =// Grand Admiral. =// You heard the order. Order the retreat now. =// yes, Grand Admiral. Ordering the retreat now. =// Apophis did not blame the crew member for asking confirmation of the order. He also knew that whoever he had been talking to had taken a huge risk by asking the question, because most Terran admirals would have him executed for posing it, but not Apophis. If they remained here, the creatures would eventually feed on all the Haddock-class ships. And then the planetary defense grid would finish them. But if they retreated, he could salvage a portion of the fleet, and the creature would turn to the only other source of food around. Tilde the enemy fleet and Seta, Tilde so tactically speaking, retreating was the right thing to do. As if on cue, the sensors came back online. Apophis made his way to one of the control consoles and checked them. It turned out that their reactivation was no coincidence. Somebody down in the engine room had managed to reboot the sensors. Tilde time to see how things are going. Tilde all the Haddock-class ships that could jump away on their own were doing so. The rest were being towed away by the surviving Ulkesh and support ships. A jolt told him that the Rome was now also being towed. Seconds later, the ship entered hyperspace and he lost sensors contact. Zacharias Bridge, 06.19.2022, 1307. The Terrans were gone, leaving the surviving ships alone with the clouds. If the clouds attacked them, there was nothing they could do about it. Tilde Apophis was counting on them doing that, Tilde Laren thought, but the clouds had other plans. They turned away from the planet and vanished in a rainbow of light. "It's over," O'Neill said. "For now," Laren began. "But as soon as he realizes his plan didn't work, Apophis will be back." Not in the short term. His fleet took quite the pounding. "Speaking of which, we have work to do." O'Neill nodded, and the two of them began overseeing the repairs to the Zacharias. Saudi Arabia Press Room, 07.01.2022, 0800. Amr Nadir waited for the transmission to begin. His superior gave him a nod, and he stepped up to a lectern facing dozens of cameras. "Tilde, here we go." Tilde, this was a transmission that had been in the works for years. It had been in 2002 that Saudi Arabia had first heard whispers about something happening at Cheyenne Mountain. Over the years, Saudi Arabia had managed to scrape together pieces of the puzzle. And eventually, they had found allies. Tilde other countries locked out of whatever is happening there. Tilde together, they had discovered it was not just the Americans locking them out. The Russians, the Chinese, and many other nations knew what Cheyenne Mountain was really doing. But Saudi Arabia and her allies had been blacklisted for some reason. Tilde, and then the crash happened. Tilde, their examination had confirmed a lot of their theories and led the way to an NID officer called Alexander Farrell. Although how was kind of vague, Nadir was not complaining. Because Farrell had confessed to murdering a report called Armin Selig and provided a copy of his files. It had been those files that had cracked the mystery wide open. And so here he was. "Ladies and gentlemen of the world press, I am Amr Nadir. Thank you all for coming. Today I want to brief you all on something called the Stargate program. 27 making plans and picking up the pieces. Stargate Command General's Office, 07.2, 3.2022, 0800. The last 3 weeks had been a roller coaster. In the good news category, the repairs on the capital ships were done, and construction of replacement Vanir ships and F-302s were on schedule. But it was the bad news category that had thrown the program into major turmoil. Saudi Arabia had made major revelations about the Stargate program and the Atlantis expedition. If it had just been them, the IOA would have been able to handle it. But North Korea had torpedoed their chances by following up with their own revelations mere hours later. And that had opened the metaphorical floodgates. Every country on the blacklist that had even the smallest inkling of the Stargate program had come forward. And with that much evidence, there had been no cover story in the world that would keep the truth from coming out, which was exactly what had been happening for the last couple of weeks. And as expected, it had turned the world upside down. There were political debates and incidents all over the world, and the angry was not just limited to people outside the United States. Carter had been forced to lock down the base today because there was a large angry crowd outside the perimeter. She had also been yelled at by the governor of Colorado, who had not been briefed of the Stargate program. which had not been the only angry call she had received recently. At the same time, there were riots going in major cities. There were also heated theological arguments all over the place, with one exception. Vatican City had calmly issued several statements in support of the existence of alien life. They were doing their best to calm things down on all fronts. But it would still be a long time before the dust settled. Meanwhile, the rest of Galaxy was also in deep trouble. Despite Earth and her allies helping where they could, the Terrans were conquering world after world. The Kremlin and Pentagon had crunched the numbers and agreed that it was only a matter of weeks before the conquest of the Milky Way galaxy was complete. And as Carter was reading in the latest reports from Atlantis, things in the Pegasus galaxy were not going much better. The Wraith were rallying as many hives and cruisers as they could while launching counterattacks. They were slowing the Terrans down, but it was not going to change the outcome. Tilda, especially once the Terrans finish in the Milky Way, once they did that, they would send additional forces to Pegasus, and the balance would be tipped to the Terrans. There was a knock on her door, and she looked up from the report. "Enter." The door opened, and Evan Lorne came in. Promoted to Brigadier General, he had been appointed as commander of Langara Base. The brigadier was carrying a pile of documents. Carter was about to tell him to sit down when Shepard entered the room. Like Lorne, he was carrying a pile of paperwork. "Ah, the joys of bureaucracy," Carter began. "Have a seat." Lorne and Shepard put the files down on Carter's desk and sat down across her. "So, how's morale out there?" "It's bad," Lorne said. "The teams are doing what they can, but it's not enough." "Things in the fleet aren't much better," Shepard said. "We need a victory," Lorne said. "Any victory." Tilda, just like Sheridan and Earth Force, needed against the Minbari. Tilda, Carter thought as she leaned back in her chair. The problem was that she did not have a plan to deliver them such a victory. And even if they attacked the Terrans with all their ships, the chances were not looking good. They could attack small Terrans patrols, but it would not make much of a difference in the bigger picture. Tilda and the crews would know that. Tilda still, they had to do something. Tilda, even if it's just to keep the enemy off balance. Tilda that, and they needed to give the few resistance cells that remained hope. Tilda and supplies. Tilda, so the three brigadiers started planning their next move. White House Oval Office 07.2, 3.2022, 0915. President Quinn had just finished his third diplomatic phone call of the day. With the Stargate program exposed, the world had been turned upside down, so Quinn was trying to get it back on track. He had already called the Queen of Great Britain and the Prime Minister of Australia. The last call had been an incoming one from the President of the Navajo Nation. Quinn needed all the support he could get, and he was glad that the Navajo were offering theirs. The relationship between the U.S. government and the Native American tribes had contained many a black page. But he had hoped that this could be a chance to mend some fences. Tilda, but I'm going to need more allies. Tilda. And the truth was that most of the governors were very unhappy. The governor of Colorado was especially angry, and Quinn couldn't blame him. If he was going to pull this situation out of the fire, he would have to change their minds first. But that would be far from easy, so he would need backup. Tilda, starting with General O'Neill. He's going to love that, but he'll understand. Tilda O'Neill would be a good start, but he would not be enough. He picked up his landline, which was red. When he got in here, there had been 2 phones on desk. One of the phones had been removed while the other had been replaced by the red unit. Quinn knew it was a cliché, but that was the fun of it. There were 32 numbers programmed into the speed dial memory of the phone. Tilda gotta start somewhere. Tilda, he dialed 31 and waited for the person on the other end to pick up. Stargate Command Gate Room 07.2 3.2022, 0917. Cameron Mitchell was the first to arrive in the gate room. Carter and the other brigadiers were still plotting, so it was only Sergeant Anders and technical staff in the control room. Vala and Teal'c were next to arrive. The two of them were discussing the situation in the galaxy. As they talked about their mission to P2X110 and its possible suitability as an evacuation site, Mitchell turned to the control room and gave Anders his cue to begin dialing. It was at this point that Daniel Jackson entered the gate room. "Glad you decided to join us," Mitchell said. "Sorry, I was on video call with Jonas," Jackson began. "We've been comparing notes trying to figure out Anubis' next move." Mitchell nodded, and the Stargate finished dialing. "Let's go, kids," Mitchell began. "We've got a planet to explore." Teal'c and Vala went through the gate first, followed by Daniel Jackson. Mitchell made his way up the ramp. Things were bad, but SG-1 had no intention of giving up. They had defeated the Goa'uld and the Ori, and they would either defeat the Terrans or go down fighting. Tilda time to get to work. Tilda, like he had said, they had a planet to explore, so he got to it. Dakara High Council Chamber 07.2 3.2022 1002. The High Council of the Free Jaffa was finally being re-established. For the past couple of weeks, the worlds that had not fallen to the Terrans had been in survival mode. It was only in the last 2 days that things had begun to settle. Tilda, how things have changed, Tilda Nessa thought. When she had arrived, she had not wanted to represent the Hactile. Now, she was glad there were any Hactile left to represent. It had taken time, but she had managed to gather 122 survivors. They had settled in a small town called Rasvo, which had been left in disarray because they had lost warriors and leaders in the Terran attack. Under their leadership, the town had gotten back to being organized. In fact, it was now the capital of a coalition of 11 small towns. And that coalition was now leading the efforts to set up a new planet council that would rule Dakara. Once it was up and running, Nessa would be their representative on the High Council. The only other member of the council was Master Braddock, who would represent all the other worlds except Dar Eshkalan. Dar Eshkalan would be represented by Ishta. Of course, the plan was to expand the council over time, but that was a tomorrow problem. Today, they had other things to worry about. "We need to secure our space, Master Braddock," Nessa said. "The Lucian Alliance shipyards are at full capacity, but I fear their best efforts will not be enough," Braddock said. "Especially if the enemy attacks Langara and severs our only supply line." Langara was located between Free Jaffa space and the Lucian Alliance. It was the key location of the supply line between the two allies. After the invasion, the Free Jaffa had expected that it would be a while before the Terrans would be able to attack again. But then, Anubis had taken the throne. With his knowledge of ancient technology, there was no doubt that he would be able to accelerate the Terrans' plans and upgrade their fleet. Even with Tory support, the Langarans will not be able to resist the full force of the Terrans, Ishta said. "I fear it is so," Braddock said. "Perhaps there is another way," Nessa began. "We have been building and refitting Ulkesh with the improved staff weapons. Our plan was to deploy these to the systems deeper inside our space. But perhaps we would be better off trading some of our Ulkesh for the Langaran Teltax. This would greatly increase the firepower of the Langaran fleet." "What about the inner systems?" Ishta said. "Even if we deploy the Langaran vessels, they would be left with severely weakened defenses." "This is true. However, without the Langaran supply line, we not get our Haddock and the Jaffa nation will fall in the end." Braddock paused and collected a scroll of paper from a nearby table. He unrolled the paper. "There is, however, the world of Mivoras." "I have never heard of Mivoras," Ishta said. "Few have. You know how our people came from the Tory?" Nessa and Ishta nodded. "The Chapa-eye that Ra used when he reigned there was actually the second one to be placed there. He was forced to do so because the Chapa-eye placed by the ancients was no longer usable. The Chapa-eye he placed, however, had to come from some place, and that world was Mivoras. But that world is lost, and even if we find it, what good will it do us?" Ishta asked. During Ra's reign as a supreme system lord, Mivoras was used to dump wreckage of destroyed vessels. There are clues to its location in the records of several system lords. If we can piece them together, we can find Mivoras. But wouldn't those ships be outdated? Nessa asked. Again, true. But Ra was cunning. I suspect there was a specific reason he chose that world, something that he would not wish his fellow system lords to find. Hence, he removed the Chappa Eye. Let's see what we have to work with. The three of them sat around the papers and began the search for Mivoras. Jumper 1 Cockpit 0 7.2 3.2022 1002. AR-1 was ready for a mission to M4X 337. After the battle with the Terrans, the Pride of the Genii had made a trip to the planet and discovered that the shadow creature Atlantis had sent there was gone, which put the planet back on the map as a destination. It was a barren world, but that was exactly what made it attractive as a possible safe world from the Terrans. Tilda, if they think it is too barren, they might ignore it. Tilda Taylor thought. The question was it actually too barren? So AR-1 was assigned to explore it. Vasily Orlov was behind the controls, while Taylor sat next to him and Ronan and McKay sat in the back. Orlov had just lowered the jumper into the gate room and was lining up the jumper. The original plan had been for Elizabeth Weir to join them, but Mr. Woolsey had assigned her to lead a plotting session with Atlantis allies. He had then decided to go on the mission himself. Tilda, with all the turmoil, I can't blame him for wanting to get away for a bit. Tilda Woolsey was sitting on one of the benches in the rear section. "You okay back there?" Taylor asked. "I'm fine," Woolsey said. "It's just been a while since I've been off-world." "Here we go," Orlov said as he dialed the gate. "Anybody want to give the order, ma'am, sir?" Taylor and Woolsey gave one another looks. Woolsey gave Taylor a nod and Taylor gave the order. "Tilda, it is her team after all. I'm just along for the ride," Tilda Woolsey thought. Then the jumper began passing through the event horizon and the mission began. Hive Ship Grand Conqueror Bridge 07.2 3.2022 1002. Guide watched as what was left of his alliance limped toward safety. The tactical situation was bad. Guide had been around during the First Assyrian War. That war had left the Wraith severely weakened, and it had essentially opened the door for the Wraith's defeat at the Tory. He had expected that would be as bad as it got, but he had been wrong. The Terran War was worse, much worse. The human population they had access to was not enough to sustain large numbers of Wraith. And the ones that were awake had been decimated. So even if they wanted to, breaking the peace treaty with Tory was not an option. They simply didn't have the resources. Tilda, so, here we are, clinging to a rock at the very edge of the galaxy. Tilda. The planet they were headed for was called M8G 352 by the Tory. It had once been by them to hold a group of converted Wraith. But that was a story for another day. What mattered toward was that it was inhabitable and that it lacked a Stargate. Using it as a rallying point would hopefully buy them time to come up with a new strategy. "Commander," Bone White said, "we have entered sensor range of the planet. Have any other vessels made it there?" 3 Hive ships and 2 cruisers, Commander. "Good," Guide said with a nod. Counting the Grand Conqueror, their alliance was down to 4 Hive ships and 3 cruisers. Tilda, how the mighty have fallen. Tilda and the crews of the remaining ships were far from complete. Even with the reinforcements they were about to meet up with, the odds were not in their favor. But they would be better they were now. Tilda and I will take whatever I can get. Tilda now it was only a matter of them getting there. Because if they did not, the future of the alliance would be very short. 28, are you kidding me? USS Spira, Mess Hall 07.2 3.2022 0730. The mess hall was full of people eating breakfast as Colonel Vale came in, and not everybody was from the Spira. It had been Colonel Yin's idea to boost morale by having crew members visit other ships. The crowd in the mess hall was made out of people from every ship in the fleet. Vale collected his meal and made his way to one of the picnic tables that filled the room. He sat down between Jennifer Haley and John McAllister, with Dr. Vilazzo being the last person on this side. Vilazzo sat across from Tamara Johansson, who was next to Dylan Calhoun. Calhoun was next to Tizalo, and the final seat was taken by Matthew Scott. Vilazzo and TJ were talking about a patient, while Tizalo and Scott were talking about piloting starships. Calhoun was looking at Tizalo's breakfast with a surprised look. "Never seen or seen any food, lad?" McAllister asked. "Not before today, Colonel. You?" "No," McAllister began. "But in the air service, I ate a lot of food from a lot of places." "Of course the details are all classified, right?" Haley said with a smile. "Aye, that they are." He winked at Haley and then turned to Vale. "So, Colonel, what did you have for breakfast? Back in your old uniform, I mean." "Bread, cheese, and olives. Maybe some piece of meat or some fruit on a good day," Vale said, before taking a bite out of his tuna sandwich. "Tilda, this is good. Tilda, you know, Colonel Yin was right to suggest this. It's been a while since we've had an opportunity to talk. Especially about something other than Terrans and war." "You're right about that," Scott said. "So how about a toast?" Scott raised his cup. "To not talking about Terrans and war." "Sounds go to me," Vale said. "To not talking about Terrans and war," everybody said as they knocked their cups together. "So," TJ said, "what are we going to talk about?" "Well, I was thinking we could do a movie night in the Austerlitz's F-302 bay," McAllister said. "The question is, what movie should we show? Any suggestions?" Scott made the first suggestion, and soon there was a discussion going. Because the group at the table were busy talking, none of them noticed Colonel Yin come in. He saw them talking and smiled. Tilda, it worked. Tilda, then he went to score himself some breakfast and find a seat. USS Spira Bridge, 07.2, 3.2022, 0752. While Vale was having breakfast, Cadman was running things on the bridge. Spira was located near Sedna, keeping an eye out of incoming Terran forces. She was not alone in the outer solar system, with the George Hammond, Austerlitz, and Tria also patrolling this area. The rest of the fleet was located closer to Earth. Things were quiet, so the bridge crew was minimal. Alec Carlson was at engineering, G-Al was doing the flying, and Sinara was covering science. "So, what do you think the IOA will do?" G-Al asked. "Whatever it is, you can bet it's going to take forever for them to decide," Carlson said. "That's bureaucrats for you," Cadman said. "Some things are universal," Sinara began. "Back home, the imperial bureaucrats were no better." Cadman snickered at that. One of the perks of serving on the Spira had been that the IOA had been far away, which had made them less of a nuisance. It had also helped tons that the former F-team had been overseeing the Nova Roma expedition. And while she agreed that the International Oversight Authority was normally slow, things were far from normal now. Besides the reveal of the Stargate program having turned things upside down, there was also the threat of the Terrans. Tilda, this is war and they know it. Tilda, which meant that the IOA knew that they had to get their act together. Tilda, let's hope they come up with a good plan. Tilda, because in the past, the IOA's plans had not been the best. "Anybody going to one of the other ships for breakfast?" Carlson asked. "Not me," Sinara said. "I've been reading up on the history of the Pegasus galaxy. I need food and sleep." "Actually, I have been invited to tour Stargate Command," G-Yal said. "I've been waiting to go for a while, but it wasn't until now that I've been able to arrange going." "I'm going to the Austerlitz," Cadman said. "You?" "Austerlitz as well," Carlson said with a nod. They finished their shift running diagnostics. Vale took over at command, Xander Henderson was the engineer, while T. Zalo relieved the helm and Dylan Calhoun came to take over science. She headed to the mess hall and got herself some food. One of the perks of being in the Milky Way galaxy were the much shorter supply lines. For Spira, this resulted in a larger selection of foods in the mess hall. She went for orange juice, a pair of tuna sandwiches, and blue jelly. She found a seat between a human she didn't know and Allison Porter, who was talking to the person next to her. She was eating her sandwiches when the man turned to her. "Hello, I'm Colonel Yin." "Hello, I'm Sinara," she paused. "You're the commander of the Tria, aren't you?" "That's me. So, what do you think of Earth?" "Well, it took some major getting used to. In the Empire, there are no nations. All the planets are unified under the imperial governments, and everybody speaks the same language." "Do you miss it?" "My family, yes. The Empire, no," she sighed. "Leaving wasn't easy, but I had to. If I had stayed, I would have put innocent people in the Senate's crosshairs, and I am now halfway across the universe." "Sorry, I didn't mean to open old wounds." "It's okay, it's not your fault." She decided to change the subject. "So, tell me about the Tria. Made any shocking developments about the ancients yet?" "Unfortunately, the Tria is a warship, so the database is mostly about practical things. Engineering, weapons, and science, subjects like that. There is very little data about ancient society." "You think there's anything in there that could help us against the Terrans?" "I'm sure there is. The problem is that ancient technology is so advanced that retroengineering it takes forever, even with the resources of Earth to work with." They continued talking until she finished her meal. Then she headed for her quarters, while Colonel headed back to his ship. As she passed the gate room, she couldn't help stopping and looking at the Stargate. Ever since they had been recalled to Earth, the gate had been dormant. "Tilda, will we ever head out again and dust off the old girl?" Tilda, Sinara, took a deep breath and continued on her way to her quarters. When she got there, she took off her boots and plummeted onto her bed. 2 seconds later, she was soundly asleep. Jumper 1 Rear Section 07.2, 3.2022, 0805. John McAllister sat in the rear section with Laura Cadman and Alec Carlson, while Colonel Yin was in one of the chairs in the cockpit. McAllister had a paper notepad out, where he was writing down observations. It was Alec Carlson who decided to ask him about what he was doing. "Doing research for movie night." "No, this is for something more serious," McAllister said. "I've been wondering about destiny. We know it's a cycle. Every time an incarnation of the ship reached the end of its journey, it moves one universe over and goes back in time, where it transmits a signal and becomes the catalyst for the construction of the next version of the ship. Which means that our destiny is somewhere in the Terran universe. But who in their universe built the next version?" "Exactly. The ancients are a race of bloodthirsty conquerors who only lasted long enough to plant the seeds of the Terran Empire. The Terrans and their version of the Zivalo are not advanced enough, and that universe only has a handful of Ori. They have the smarts to build a destiny, but not the numbers and the resources. So, who built the Terran universe version?" "I have no idea. You?" "No. I've managed to scrape together just enough proof to make a case that this version of destiny might exist. But that's it." Which he thought was really annoying. Alas, for now, there was nothing he could about it. U.S. Austerlitz, Hangar Bay 07.25.2022, 2003. After some consideration, it had been decided that the movie night would consist of 2 movies. By popular request, the first one would be the original Jurassic Park. The second movie had been picked by lottery. It had been Die Hard 3 that had been ended up landing the second slot. All the seats were full, and everybody was focused on the movie. The lawyer was being eaten by the T-Rex when Allison Porter suddenly had an idea. Alec Carlson had told her about Colonel McAllister's questions about the Terran universe of destiny. At the time, she had not had any ideas about who could be the builders, But as she watched the T-Rex do its thing, inspiration had struck her. Tilda, could it be that simple? Tilda may be the reason they had not been able to figure it out, was the obvious. Tilda, because it's an advanced species we know little about. Tilda, and she had several candidates. But running down her list would have to wait. She had never seen this movie, so she wanted to know how it ended. Besides, if there was another version of Destiny in the Terran universe, there was a good chance that it could wait for a couple more hours for them to figure out who built it. M8G 352 plane 07.2 5.2022 2005. Guide watched as his fellow Wraith build things around him. The Wraith had succeeded in gathering enough ships to defend the planet from any Terran patrol that might come along. They had also come up with a plan to go back on the offensive. But they would not be ready to execute it for another 3 weeks. In the meantime, they had begun construction of a cloning facility. The first time the Wraith had built a cloning facility, they had powered it using zero-point modules they had stolen from the ancients. That facility had been destroyed years ago, and this time around, there were no ZPMs to power the new facility. But the plane they had selected was near several volcanoes. There was also a large river running across the plain. The plan was to tap the volcanoes and the river for power and fill the plane with a massive solar panel array. It was not a perfect solution, but presuming it worked, they would be able to replenish their numbers to provide their ships with full crews. Once that was done, they would be able to move forward with their plan. Tilda and build the colony. Tilda, while the fleet would execute the plan, the cloning facility would see about creating a hidden Wraith colony on the planet. Just in case the original plan didn't work. Tilda, this rock could end up being the place where the Wraith made their last stand. Tilda, his communications device activated. // commander / Bone White said. // we have had a development here. // While Guide was inspecting the work on the surface, Bone White was in command of the Grand Conqueror. Besides serving as the flagship for the new fleet, it was now the home to one of 3 surviving queens. The other 2 queens would remain on the planet and wire themselves into the cloning facility. What kind of development? Guide asked. If the Terrans had somehow found them, Bone White would have simply said that. Tilda, so there is something else happening. Tilda, and the chances of the cloud creatures showing up was remote. Tilda, they have bigger prices to go after. Tilda. // I am sending the telemetry down to the facility right now, Commander. // Stand by. He walked into the facility, which was still under construction. Fortunately, there were several rooms that were already complete. This included the control room. Guide activated one of the consoles and keyed in his command code. The display changed to show the telemetry that Bone White had sent down. It was information from the Hive ship's long-range sensors. Tilda, what in the? Tilda, the sensors showed 2 fleets passing through the area, and both fleets belonged to some unknown race. Fleet number 1 consisted of 36 vessels. They were clustered in 6 groups of 6 and were on a course deeper into the Pegasus galaxy. The other fleet consisted of only 5 ships and was headed out of the galaxy. His instincts told Guide that things were about to get much more complicated in the Pegasus galaxy. 29, you are ending this thing. EUS Austerlitz Commander's Quarters 08.05.2022 1205. Austerlitz had been away from the solar system for the last couple of days, attacking small Terran patrols with the HMCS Liberty and RFS Korolev. At the same time, the USS Spira had been ordered to a nearby solar system without a Stargate. They had then gone on the offensive against several small outposts that had been left vulnerable by the Austerlitz attacks. But now, the ship was back in Earth's solar system. And it was at this point that John McAllister had received a surprise in his message folder. After movie night, Dr. Allison Porter had come to him with a theory about what he was now calling New Destiny. They had decided to share their ideas with the people on Atlantis. And while the Austerlitz had been doing her thing, the science team on Atlantis had been turning the ancient database inside out. They had been looking for information on advanced species unknown to the Tory and their allies, and their findings had left them with a likely candidate. He was reading their report when the ship went to alert. Tilda, now what? Tilda, he grabbed her receiver of the intercom next to his desk. McAllister to bridge, what's going on? // Colonel, we're monitoring a battle at the edge of the short-range sensors. // Gerda de Vries said. // there are no friendlies involved, but I think you will want to see this, sir. // I'll be right there. In the meantime, see if you can recalibrate the long-range sensors to get a better look. // I, Colonel. // He hung up the intercom and headed for the bridge. When he got there, de Vries had finished the recalibration, and one of the view screens showed the sensor readings they were getting. It showed a battle taking place between a mid-sized Terran force and another force. The problem was that the second force was not marked as unknown, which in this case was a major problem. McAllister worked the controls to see more details. Tilda, okay, this is so not good. Tilda, he turned to de Vries. Is the Spira seeing this? Yes, sir, de Vries said. Do you want me to open a channel? Yes, pipe it to the intercom on console 7, which was the intercom on the console below the display with the data. Yes, sir, de Vries said while working her controls. A small green light activated underneath the receiver, indicating that the channel was open. Tilda, here we go. Tilda, he picked up the unit. It was Colonel Vale on the receiving end. Mark, please tell me these readings are wrong. // I'd love to tell you that, John, but we've confirmed the ID of the second force. Twice. // How is that even possible? // I have no idea, but I can tell you this, the brass is not going to be happy when they hear about this. // Thanks, Mark. He put the receiver back in its cradle and looked at the readings. Tilda, if Mark says this is true, then it's true. Tilda, because Vale and Young were the experts on this. But McAllister agreed that the brass would indeed not be happy when they found out that the Livexona, or 60s, were back. McAllister was glad he wasn't the one who would have to break them the news. Tis Superior Bridge, 08.05.2022, 12:05. The Superior was a work in progress. Like her predecessor, she would be a strength-class vessel. But thanks to Emperor Anubis, she would have more extensive ancient upgrades and improved Wraith technology as well. She was one of 2 Markroman II vessels under construction, with the other being a new and improved Terran 1. Until she was complete, Grand Admiral Apophis would use the shipyard as his headquarters. Said shipyard was a space station in orbit of P8X 362. As soon as he entered the bridge, Apophis was greeted by Dr. Meredith Rodney McKay. McKay was the officer overseeing the construction of these new vessels. Grand Admiral, he said with a bow, I am happy to report that we are on schedule, sir. And the Omega. McKay's face fell. It was well known that the work on the Omega system was behind schedule, but the construction crew had apparently made McKay think that the Grand Admiral was unaware. Because if he had known that the Grand Admiral knew, he would have taken his fears out on them. And Apophis knew that, but he also knew that the problems were not their fault. So he did not blame them, nor did he blame them from keeping the truth from McKay. McKay managed to squeeze out. Take me to the Omega section, Apophis said. Yes, Grand Admiral. McKay led the Grand Admiral out of the bridge, and neither of them noticed the welder who had overheard everything. The man put down his welder and walked into the nearest toilet. Once he was sure he was secure, he took out a communications device and sent out a message. Tilde Omega confirmed. Cover intact, 12 out. Tilde, and then he went back to work. Flagship Hidden Warrior Bridge 08.05.2022. 12:05. Fleet Commander 2K-R11 read the message from Agent 12 and added it to the list of incoming intelligence. The Stargate had begun infiltrating the Terran Empire in both the Milky Way galaxy and Pegasus several weeks ago. And Agent 12 was far from the only one in place near Grand Admiral Apophis. Meanwhile, the fleet commander had been implementing several changes to the fleet. To begin with, his command had been split in half. The first fleet was assigned to the Milky Way, while the second fleet with its own commander had been sent to the Pegasus galaxy to support the Stargate's efforts there. Next, he had named all of the ships that remained under his command. And so it was that his flagship had become the Hidden Warrior. The hidden part of the name was a reference to the next change of the fleet, the installation of cloaking devices. Finally, there had also been upgrades to the weapons array. So, Omega is real. This will complicate things. They would have to do something about it, and done so soon. For now, he turned to his helmsman and gave him the order to move to the next collection location. M3A 716 Victory City, Marketplace 08.05.2022, 12:08. The leader of the Bolokai was dead. His head had been chopped off by Keros, who was now the king of the Bolokai. The two of them had fought to the death, and the old leader had lost. Until 2012, the Bolokai had been a race of nomadic warriors who had been hated by many in the Pegasus galaxy. And then, the Wraith Peace Treaty had been signed, and things had changed. It had been in this year that Henry the Builder has seized leadership of the tribe. Before then, the Bolokai had been led by a council of elders. Henry had slaughtered them all and declared himself king of the Bolokai. He had then settled all the Bolokai on this planet. In the years since, he had earned the title of the Builder by enslaving the peoples of several small backwater worlds and using them to build the City of Victory. He had also focused on increasing the Bolokai's level of technology. His greatest invention had been a version of cement. This had allowed the Bolokai to build stone structures up to 3 floors tall. These buildings had flat roofs that had been turned into gardens. They had also begun breeding animals for eating and milking. At the same time, the Bolokai had been boosting their numbers by forcing any surviving slaves into military service. While all of this had been happening, Keros had been biding him time. His grandfather, Lex the Great, had been one of the elders that Henry had slaughtered. And today, Keros had decided it was the day to avenge him. So he had gone to the market and challenged Henry to a fight he had won. Finally, somebody stepped forward from the crowd that had been watching. It was an old man in the robes of a scribe. One of the changes Henry had implemented was that those too old to fight had to make themselves useful in some other way. This man had apparently become a scribe in the town library. It was their task to put the knowledge and the laws of the Bolokai to paper and guard the resulting collection. The scribe took Henry's crown and offered it to Keros. All hail King Keros, ruler of the Bolokai. The crowd bowed down before him. He took the crown from the scribe and put it on his head. "Burn that," he said, pointing to Henry's remains. "I will be inspecting my realm." And with that, he walked away. He saw the scribe signal to several people, who set to executing his order. Victory was located on the coast of a large continent. It had small harbor filled with fishing vessels and a dry dock that Keros had big plans for, Tilde and the portal. The portal was currently located far outside the city, but he intended to have the ring and its control device moved. Once that was done, the Bolokai would move into the galaxy and make themselves known once more. 30, on a cliffhanger. USS Spira Vale's quarters 08.07.2022, 0757. Vale had finished reading the latest reports just in time for his next shift. Things in both the Milky Way and the Pegasus galaxy were getting more complicated as enemies kept coming out of the woodworks. In the Milky Way, the 60s were attacking the Terrans left and right. It led to compiling losses, but wasn't really slowing them down. The problem was that while the drones currently seemed to be focusing on the larger threat, it was only a matter of time before they came knocking on Earth's door. And the same could be said for the shadow clouds and Atlantis. The clouds, which had turned out to be called the Apava, were currently attacking the Terran fleet. It had been Dr. McKay who had found their name in the ancient database during his new Destiny research for Colonel McAllister. There was also plenty of proof that the Apava had become a LOT more intelligent since the ancients had captured one of their kind for study. As if the Terrans and Apava were not enough trouble, the Bolokai had also begun attacking former Wraith worlds and capturing their technology. Based on the reports, the formerly nomadic tribe had clear dreams of empire. Tilda along with acquiring more advanced technology. Tilda, as for the Wraith, they had vanished. Tilda leaving their world open for the Bolokai, Tilda Vale thought as he left his quarters. He made his way up the spiral staircase and walked onto the bridge. Spira and Chaser had finally left Earth's solar system and had delivered a load F-302s to Langara base. The F-302s didn't fit through the Stargate. So they had been loaded into the Chaser's cargo bays and clamped to the Spira's hull. They had left the fighters at the base and were now headed home. This meant that the bridge was fully manned when he came in. Dylan Calhoun and Sonara were at the science consoles, discussing the ancient ruins at Dakara. They had not told them what they would be carrying yet, but the brass had made it clear that Dakara would be the destination of their next supply run. Xander Henderson and Alec Carlson were manning the engineering consoles, while T-Zalo and G-Yal were flying the ship. Completing the crew was Carl Grogan, who was at the weapons console. "How are we doing, Major?" "Good, Colonel," Grogan said. "No malfunctions and we're on schedule so far." "And Chaser?" "Keeping pace to port, sir." Vale looked at the sensors reading on Grogan's monitor. Tilda good. Tilda he gave the Major a nod and then sat down in the command chair. As he did so, a purple light sparked into life above the Spira. This light began to grow and quickly formed into a cocoon around the ancient ship. As it did, it grew brighter and brighter. Vale saw this happen on the sensors. "Report." "Whatever it is not affecting the FTL drive," Carlson said. "Identification." "It's not in the database, Colonel," Calhoun said. "It's nothing we've encountered before, but it is getting thicker, sir. Because the sensor lock on the Chaser is fading, boss." "Grogan, how are we doing in the communications department?" "The intercom is still working, but all the external channels are down, sir," Grogan said. "Activate." That was as far as he got before the energy touched the Spira. It penetrated the hull and filled the entire ship. Vale felt tingling through his entire body, but there was no pain. Then the ship dropped out of faster than light speed. This was followed by what felt like the ship falling through a hole. Then the energy faded, and Spira was sent tumbling. Fortunately, T-Zalo Quick proved why he was chief pilot and stabilized the ship. Vale hit several buttons, and the computer showed him what the sensors were seeing. "Colonel," Sonara began, "did we just get—" "I'm afraid so." "Again," Grogan said. "What is it with this ship getting zapped around the universe?" "Let's confirm what happened first," Vale said. "Alec, we need a diagnostic on the ship. Sergeant Henderson, see where we stand on supplies and equipment. Let's get to work, people." There were nods and acknowledgments as the crew did just that. Spira had been thrown across time and space before, and she had survived. Tilda and we will again. Tilda, but he did wonder what had happened to the Chaser. Stargate Command Control Room 08.07.2022. 0815. What do you mean, the Spira vanished? General Carter said to the monitor. 5 minutes ago, Carter had been in the briefing room, briefing SG-4, SG-7, and SG-22. The 3 teams were going on a mission to back up a Takra infiltration of a Terran shipyard soon, and Carter had been telling them the game plan when Sergeant Anders had sounded the alarm. Which was how Carter had ended up in the control room. Colonel Haley had briefed her on how the Spira had been surrounded by a cocoon of purple energy and had then slowly faded away. Then, the cocoon had vanished in a flash, causing the chaser to be thrown out of hyperspace. It had not been easy to allow the chaser and Spira to monitor one another. Because Spira had an FTL drive and chaser had a traditional hyperdrive. Fortunately, the new Assurans had earned their pay for the year and come up with a workaround. After being thrown out, it had taken some time to make sure that Chaser and her crew were still in one piece. The good news was that while there were some wounded, nobody had died, and the ship was still intact. The bad news was that Spira had vanished. While Haley was bringing Carter up to speed, her crew was going over the area where the ship had vanished. =/==, we're sending the telemetry right now, General. =/==, Haley began. =/=, and I ordered Chaser to double back and look over the area, ma'am. =/=. I want hourly updates on this, Colonel, Carter said. SGC out. She didn't have to signal Anders to cut the transmission, because he had correctly guessed was what she wanted. One of the screens changed to show the telemetry that Chaser was sending over. At the same time, Sergeant Anders was silencing the alarm. He had barely done so when the computer sounded the alarm again. What the? Tilda Carter was about to ask Anders to find out what was going on, but the sergeant was already on it. General, we have an incoming fleet, he said. Terran. No, ma'am, Anders said. I'm reading 7 ships, about the size of BC 304. The computer tried to identify them, but there is nothing even remotely similar in the database, ma'am. He hit several keys, and one of the screens in the room changed to show the course of incoming vessels. They will enter orbit in 10 seconds, ma'am. Get me. That was as far as she got before a teleporter snatched her away. When the beam faded, she was in a room that was unlike anything she had ever seen before. There was no furniture in the room, except for a pair of chairs. One chair was empty, while other one was taken by an alien who was not from any species she had ever seen before. It signaled towards the empty chair with a hand with 4 fingers, so Carter sat down and waited for her host to speak. Greetings, General Carter. I am Admiral Pixeller, and I am a Furling. USS Spira Bridge 08.07.2022. 0815. Spira was no longer in the universe where she had been billed. She was now in the Terran universe. This had taken the crew mere seconds to figure out. What had been much more complicated had been figuring out where exactly in said universe she was. But now, the Helm 1 console showed her location as being just beyond the Ida galaxy. Lieutenant Colonel Cadman had arrived, and they were discussing what to do next. So, where do we go? Cadman said. Going to the Milky Way or Pegasus is not an option, Vale said. Both galaxies were deep Terran territories, so going there was suicide. And the nearest galaxy, Ida, was a giant question mark. In their home universe, the Ida galaxy was Asgard space, but this was not their Ida galaxy. So were they going to roll the dice on it or not? As Vale was doing the math in his head, one of Science consoles beeped. 2 seconds later, one of the Helm consoles followed suit. Dylan, Vale said. The long-range sensors have detected something, Calhoun said. It's approaching at FTL speeds, and it is not moving through hyperspace, sir. Compare the energy signature of the FTL drive with Destiny's and our own, Vale said. Yes, sir, Calhoun said as he worked his controls. The results surprised him. The destiny signature doesn't match, but our does, sir. He hit several keys. And if I am reading this right, it is roughly the same size of Spira as well. New Spira? Cadman asked. There is only one way to find out, he turned to Tizalo. Can we intercept that ship? Not as long as we are between galaxies. But once we're inside the next galaxy, the math is looking good, Tizalo said. Guess that answers the question of where we're going, Cadman said. Sounds like a plan to me, Vale said. You know what to do, Sergeant. Yes, sir, Tizalo said. And with that, Spira jumped into faster-than-light speeds. The ship quickly became a small moving dot in the void between galaxies. Not the end,